Okay. So good morning, everybody. I hope the recording has started. My name is Claire Stokes. I'm an occupational therapist with the West Cork Child Development Services. And I work here in Bantry and Castletownbere, and I'm delighted to be on here this morning with you to present the first module of the 2 modules which are pre-recorded in the Supporting Children with Sensory Processing Difficulties course. For those of you who have registered with us, you would have received an information booklet called Understanding Sensory Behaviours, and you'll also have received a copy of today's slides and the slides for the next module as well. You'll also have been invited to attend an online live webinar. So the live webinar is a great opportunity for you to really reflect on Module 1 and Module 2 and to bring your questions and to bring your real life examples so that maybe we can problem solve them together or come up with solutions together as best we can. So today I'm going to be presenting with my colleague Trish. Trish is going to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Trish and I'm the occupational therapist covering the Clonakilty area. Some of you may know me. Just want to welcome everyone here today as well. I'm very excited that we're getting to do this webinar. And just to let everyone know that the reason that you were invited is that you identified that your child is having some sensory processing difficulties. So there may be, your child may have other diagnoses as well, but the focus of this webinar is to support your child with their sensory processing difficulties, regardless of what other diagnosis that they may have.
Thanks, Trish, it's great. So the goals for today's session and for, I suppose, for the 2 modules and the online session, so the overarching goals of the course are that really hope you will have a better understanding of the different senses and how they affect all of us, including your child. And then secondly, that you might have a better insight into your child's unique profile, their unique and individual sensory processing needs. And then finally, based on your understanding of your child's unique sensory profile, that you might know some nice strategies or learn some nice strategies that you can put in place at home independently yourself that might support your child to manage their sensory processing difficulties a little bit better and maybe feel a little bit more comfortable in themselves or comfortable in the environment. In today's module, we're really going to delve into theory. So Trish is going to take us through a lot of the different senses individually, and then we're going to look more in, I suppose, more in depth at unique sensory profiles. So sensory profiles are I suppose a way of describing the kind of most commonly seen I suppose profiles that we see. So in OT we often see children who are under responsive and children who are over responsive. So we go into describing what that really means and maybe helping you, and I suppose by describing it, hoping that maybe you might be able to identify some of these traits in your child. So just going straight into the theory now. So sensory processing is a term that we use in OT. It's kind of a fancy word or a fancy term to describe how we take in information from our environment and how we process it at the brain level and then how we respond to it. So simply put, it's how we organise all that information for use in our environment. So some examples of that might be that when you smell something that's really strong, so when those sensory organs in your nose take in that really strong odor, it sends a message to your brain saying, "Ooh, that odor is possibly not good for us," or it's not a good smell. So like the smell from maybe a strong gas or a strong chemical, and instinctively then the behavior or the appropriate response will be to move away. So our senses are always trying to protect us or alert us to things about our environment or to help us to interact in a really positive way with our environment. Unfortunately, though, sometimes that information, that message doesn't get communicated properly to the brain or gets misinterpreted by the brain, and the brain doesn't have its usual, it doesn't indicate or tell you to do the usual response. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the kids that we support. So we have 8 senses in our body. So we learn about, I suppose, the outside senses are 5 ones that we all learn about and we would know since we were in preschool. So and they're very obvious senses, because we have, I suppose, we have eyes, we have a nose, we have a tongue, we have our ears, we have our fingers, and we have our skin over our body, and it's all very visual and very obvious. And it's really those senses, we call them the outside senses, because they're all about using information, or using your senses to get information about the outside world so that you can interact really positively with the outside world. So for example, when you reach your hand into your handbag looking for your keys, you don't need to use your eyes. You can just use that sense of touch and information to find your keys. And that's really helping you to interact in a positive way with the world. And then you have the inside senses. So the inside senses is all about, I suppose, the receptors in our body that gather information up from our organs and from our muscles and joints and from our balance sense. So this is our proprioception, our vestibular and interoception, and they're telling us all about that internal state of our body and the position of our body in space. And these are ones that we wouldn't learn as much about, or we wouldn't know as much about. More commonly, you might call them your movement sense or your muscle sense. And interoception is someone who doesn't really have a kind of more colloquial word right now. But Trish is going to talk about those in more detail now later. So finally, I'm just going to show you this lovely slide here. It's this is a really child-friendly hierarchy. If you imagine those lovely triangles we get to learn about the pyramid of foods, or those triangles that we learn about the development of our motor senses and things, this is a lovely hierarchy that shows us all about development in general. And you can see right there in the foundations of the house that you have your senses, interoception. This is an old infographic, but interoception should be in there as well. So tactile, vestibular, proprioception, smell, taste, visual, auditory, and interoception should be in there as well. And really, everything we do in life is in relation to our own bodies. And as infants, even in the womb, these sensory systems are developing at a rapid pace. And the nerves, or the pathways, the neurological pathways to our brain, are being myelinated and they're being developed so that we can, when we're born, we can start to use our body really functionally, and we start to interact with the world in a really positive way. And it's based on this then that all of the rest of our development is built. So the awareness of our body, our planning and movements, our body position, and then all those hierarchy skills that you can see, those really lovely skilled functions in the balloons up there, that good listening, being able to do schoolwork and have meaningful relationships. All of those things, if you kind of come right back down to the core of them, are built on this foundation of having a really good sensory processing development, or really good sensory processing ability. And I suppose that's a really, really informative for parents as well, that we would hope in therapy, when you're working on some of these senses, that by improving a child's ability to maybe process some of this information or cope with some of this information, that maybe you're going to have a knock-on effect on all these things up the hierarchy as well, that you might see improvements in those areas. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Trish take over for the next couple of slides. And yeah.
Thanks, Claire. So as Claire said, I'm going to run you through the senses individually, and we'll see how we get on with them. The first sense that we talk about is the tactile sense, and it's most commonly known as our sense of touch. It's an extremely important sense for us, and there's lots of different types of touch receptors in our skin. This system has lots of different roles. So most importantly, though, it's the one that keeps us safe. So for example, if you're living in a jungle and you feel something light scuttling across your leg at night, your body will respond and you'll wake up very alert to see what it is to keep you safe. However, the same protective use of touch isn't as important, I guess, if you're living in a city apartment and your cat jumps up on your bed regularly at night. You mightn't even wake up though, because your sensory system has this memory, and it will learn that with repeated exposure that it will modify its response. So you won't need to wake up because your body will have learned that this is your cat jumping up at night. So your touch sense is very important for protecting us. Sorry, Claire, I'm just having a few technical problems here with moving these on.
Okay.
So,
I mean to take control, Trish, and I can move them.
No, I think it's okay now. No, I have it now again. So with that protective factor, as we said, it takes time for your touch system to adapt to your environment. And what happens is that for some children with sensory processing difficulties, it takes their sensory memory a lot longer to adapt an appropriate response to their environments. Another example is this isn't, sorry. Another thing that touch does for us is it helps us complete everyday tasks like tying buttons, and like Claire said earlier, like finding something in the bottom of your bag or finding €1 in your pocket. Also, touch can be used for calming, and you'll hear that a lot in your sessions with your OT as well. We'll use deep pressure touch to help dampen down the nervous system and to create a soothing feeling. And we do this naturally anyway. So if you get a little scratch or you bang your leg against something, you'll automatically rub it, and that helps dampen down the nervous system. So you can see that touch is important from a protective point of view, but also has an impact on our fine motor and dexterity skills, and also on our overall arousal levels. So if your child has difficulties with the touch system, what you may see is that they'll only wear certain kinds of shoes or clothing, or they'll be very particular about how the shoes or clothing goes on them. They may not like standing in line with people. They may find it hard to find something in their school bag. They may have difficulties with dressing, especially the more fiddly parts of dressing, so the shoelaces, the buttons. Difficulties with food textures may also be a sign of tactile processing difficulties. And they may not notice when their hands or their face are dirty. They may have difficulty knowing what's too hot or what's too cold, or may have very strong preferences about the water temperature for their bath. So that's the touch sense. The next one that we're going to talk about is the visual sense. So we're not here talking about your visual acuity, that's important to have checked as well. But we're talking about how the visual information is processed by the brain. So our eyes will help us understand information about objects in our surroundings. So it helps us define distance, edges, boundaries. It also contributes to how we move through space and has an important role in balance and movement. So our visual system and our vestibular system, so our balance system, they work very closely together as we walk through a classroom, or we walk through a preschool room, as we walk through an office. Common difficulties with visual processing that we see. So you'll hear a parent or a teacher saying that the child's having difficulty copying from the board. They're skipping over lines, or they're jumbling up their words. They may get very frustrated if you ask them to find something in their bag or in a drawer, and they can't quite locate it. They can't quite isolate that item and disregard everything else as they're looking. You may say with a younger child, you may see that they don't like the bright sunlight, or they might try to cover or shield their hands. With an older child, you may find that they prefer having their hoodie up because they just want to minimize that visual input that's coming into them. Visually hypervigilant is another sign, a potential sign of visual processing difficulty. So this is a child who really remembers and spots visual things in an environment much more than is usual. For a primary school child, you may find that they become upset if there's a lot of things written on the page, or they may balk at doing certain types of homework that involves lots of looking and matching, and maybe looking at one school book and copying into a copybook. For a smaller child or a younger child, it's often more out and about in the community that the parents will notice that they're trying to shield or protect their eyes a little bit more. So auditory is, again, it's not about how well you can hear, but having a hearing test, particularly for younger children, is very important, so that we know that their hearing mechanisms are working well. But more auditory processing is about perceiving and interpreting the sounds that we hear, and having an appropriate response then to that. So, for example, wherever you're sitting now, think about what noises you can hear and what impact they're having on you as you're trying to concentrate on what we're saying. Hopefully you are able to filter out most of the background noise, but some people may not be able to do that, and may have had to take themselves off into a room at the top of the house and close the door because they find it hard to filter out that background noise. And that ability to be able to filter out non-relevant noises is something that we find a lot with our younger or early primary school children, that they find it hard to be in a busy environment, or they find it hard to concentrate, or they find it hard to listen to the instruction of a preschool teacher or a teacher when there's a lot of other children around. Or it may be your primary school child who is unable to concentrate at their homework at the kitchen table, that they may need to go to their bedroom to do it. Claire, do you have anything else to say there about the auditory?
I don't think so, Trish. I think that it's very much like the tactile sense, that it can be very alerting, and it can really excite our nervous system, because we're meant to react to noises. The growl of a tiger historically would have been very alerting, and we're meant to, noises in the night or sounds in the night are meant to be very alerting, but our brain is meant to do that memory piece and teach us that it's okay and that we're safe and that there is no need to be so frightened. And unfortunately, that mechanism doesn't kick in for some kids, and they need a lot more support.
The signs of auditory difficulties or auditory processing difficulties, as we said there, getting overwhelmed, difficulty filtering sounds, easily distracted, dislike certain sounds, doesn't respond to their name being called, and as Claire said, not able to get used to certain sounds, and always having that strong reaction as to the same sound. The last of the more familiar senses are the sense of taste and smell. So these are all of the receptors here in our tongue, or as Claire said earlier, in our nose, and they work very closely together and really contribute to our sense, our enjoyment, and our function of feeding ourselves, and being able to tolerate meal times. Again, with these, you can have an oversensitivity, or you can be somebody who really can get very, very strong smells, and that it impacts them quite significantly, in that they have to leave an environment, or they get very upset because they can't manage that smell. When they may also have difficulty standing in line or close to other people. There may be some hygiene issues, because they may not realize that they themselves need to use a shower or need to wash. And the one that comes up the most for us here, though, is around the restricted food preferences. These children with taste and smell difficulties often have very strong food preferences, because it can be quite overwhelming for their sensory systems to manage new tastes, new smells, combinations of different smells. And in addition, we have the temperature of food and also the visual aspect of food. So there's a whole other workshop that we invite parents to, called our Picky Eaters workshop. And if your child has a difficulty around meal times, then do go and ask one of your team members about being invited to that. So proprioception is our sense of body awareness, and it's also our sensations. They're in our joints and our muscles. We have receptors. Those receptors send messages up to the brain and tell our brain where our body is in space. It essentially maps out our body for us, and it helps. It's the sense that tells us where our body is, even when our eyes are closed. If you have difficulty with proprioceptive processing, you will have difficulty with movements, and you may often bump or trip over things. They may be the child that people describe as the bull in the china shop, or indeed the adult. They might pet too hard, hold their pencil too tightly. They might find getting dressed too difficult, very difficult, because they might find it hard to judge where their hand is in space as they put their arm through the coat. So we do need proprioceptive input, though, to be able to function in this world. So we often, if we're not getting enough of it in our bodies, we'll often seek it out. So we will bite down on things to try and get a little bit of extra proprioception, or we'll push up next to somebody to try and get an extra little bit of sense of where we are in space. We often see children with proprioceptive difficulties in this service. So the vestibular sense is one that works very closely with the proprioceptive sense.
I was going to say, Trish, about the proprioceptive sense as well, is that sometimes what we would see is that kids who are having difficulties with some of the other senses, maybe if they're over responsive to sound or to taste or touch or whatever it might be, that they can be quite anxious or nervous about environments because they're so terrified of those experiences. And sometimes, because the proprioceptive sense has such a really regulating, dampening effect on our nervous system, that they might actually kind of use that sense to help them to cope. They might kind of scaffold themselves with that sense a little bit. So sometimes the children with difficulties in other areas might start trying to use kind of proprioceptive input to help them to feel a little bit calmer. And we do see that a little bit as well, don't we?
Lovely, yeah. So things like trying to give themselves a little bit of extra input from it to try and keep themselves calm. Give us some more examples, Terry. That I was thinking, obviously the biting on the pencil is one, and then obviously the squeezing of hands,
or seeking out lots of like real rough and tumble play, seeking out a lot of that, or being very forceful, or maybe being very stiff in their movements, or kind of so we all do that when we're nervous, actually, and a natural response to being nervous is actually to stiffen our shoulders, or we might kind of stretch. We might do a lot of stretching because we're really enacting or engaging that proprioceptive sense. So that's a natural response that anyone does to help to try to manage that overwhelming sense in their body. They might try to scaffold themselves up by recruiting proprioception because it's so grounding. It's just really, really regulating. So I think, does that make sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it's and it's linked nicely, as I said, to the sense of movement, so our vestibular sense. So this is, we would often call this our balance sense. It's our sense that tells us which way is up, and it's found inside the inner ear. And it sends information to our brain about balance, muscle tone, postural control. And then it also contributes to our movements and our arousal levels. So our ability to manage our own alertness levels. And it's a key system for helping coordinate the eyes and the head and the body all together. So you can imagine that if you're having vestibular difficulties, you may be a child who trips and falls. We'll often see with slouched posture. Children with vestibular difficulties will often be very afraid of having their feet leave the ground or scared of movement. And on the other side of it, if you are if you're seeking out vestibular movement, or if you're a person who needs a lot of vestibular movement, you'll be that child or that young person who is on the go all the time and fidgeting and seeking out that movement to help regulate yourself. So with all of the senses, you can, we'll get into this a little bit more, you can be under-responsive or over-responsive. But with the vestibular sense in particular, it'll be important to help identify whether your child is over-responsive or under-responsive. Because once a lot of children as well, Claire, like you were saying around the proprioception, there can be a lot of fear if you associate it with vestibular difficulties, because obviously if you're not sure which way is up, you're going to feel safer just not moving, particularly if you're oversensitive to vestibular movement.
Mm-hmm. I think just like what we talked about with touch and that touch sense, that vestibular system, it actually is two different types of receptors. Just so the touch has lots of different receptors. The touch is the receptors in the top of your skin, which are the light ones, and it has the receptors in the lower layers of your skin, which are the deep ones, and they both have a different effect on the nervous system, dampening or arousing. And the vestibular system is the same, because we know that from babies, when babies cry, we automatically rock them, and when we're rocking them, we're engaging that linear vestibular sense, that lovely rhythmic movement, and that's really dampening and regulating. So being in a rocking chair is really, really effective for kids who are who need help to kind of feel calm and have that dampening effect. But then the other sensory piece is this: there's another canals in the ear, and they're really excitatory and have a really alerting effect on the body. So it's really important to know the vestibular system can do two things for you. It can really get people revved up or wound up, especially when you're moving your head in space, or it can have that calming effect when used properly and monitored really well. And so I think that'll be really important when you get to module 2 to remember that we can use it for two functions.
The final sense there, interoception, and this is our sense, our internal sense. And these are the sensations that are within our body, so that are related to things like knowing when you're full, knowing when you're hungry, knowing when you're thirsty, when you need to go to the bathroom, when you need to, when your sleepiness. So interoception refers to the sensory feedback we receive from inside the body, and at the very basic level allows us to answer the question, how do I feel at any given point? So the example that we have here is if we notice a growling stomach, serves as a clue that we are hungry and encourages us to go and to find food. And then if we can notice that our tummies are tight or heavy, then that lets us know that we're full and it's time to stop eating. A lot of adults and children find interoception hard, and they struggle to notice their body clues and to understand then what that means and what they therefore have to do. And do you want to say anything else about interoception, Claire?
No, only that it's a really new area of research, and that the interventions for interoception, as an OT, I don't feel that confident in prescribing them yet, because the information is just still emerging, and they're still doing the research to find out what works for these kids, what is helpful for these kids, and how do you help them to understand those senses and to notice those senses. So I think it's really a very emergent area, and one that hopefully we'll be able to offer more support in the future. So am I taking control here, Trish?
Yeah, you do the next thing.
Brilliant. So we're just going to go into sensory profiles now. So There are two different types of, I suppose, sensory profiles. You've over-responsive profiles, and these are where, in general, the child in most of their sensory systems tends to be over-responsive. And then you have those under-responsive profiles. And when we say under-responsive, in general, in most of their sensory systems, maybe not all of them, but in most of them, they tend to be under-responsive. So we talked a little bit, we alluded a little bit there as we were going through those different sensory systems that children, when we talk about over and under responsive, or really what they means is, or what those terms mean. So over responsive would really mean that that child is more sensitive to it, or that they notice it much more than other children. So those children who are noticing all the visual little bits in their environment, or they're really noticing those small sounds, and they find it really hard to tune them out. And then there's those children, and what under-responsive means is that they're really not noticing it at all, or their nervous system isn't picking it up or carrying it to the brain and making it heard in the way that it should be. And as with all things in our life, our personality or our approach comes into it as well. So for some children, they can be over-responsive to something. So they might have that big nervous system response to something and feel very overwhelmed by it. And they could have two different approaches to it. So you can be quite active about managing your profile. So in the first instance, an active approach would be that you might remove yourself from the situation. You might do something about it. Oftentimes what we see for children who are over-responsive, who take an active approach, they might come across as being really rigid or controlling, because they're trying to dictate the environment. They're really trying to manage the environment so that they don't have to deal with the things that they find really, really hard on a daily basis. So sometimes they might come across as rude. I had a 17-year-old teenager who, if he was in a restaurant and the family member who was sitting next to him ordered something smelly, he would just get up and go over to his mum and he'd kind of say, move. So it wasn't that he didn't want to sit next to the person anymore, it was because of the smelly food, but that poor person didn't really, just thought that he was being so rude. And sometimes that's just the way they come across, unfortunately, misunderstood. And then there's children who are over responsive, but maybe they're really passive about it. So we see this a lot of the time, that parents tell us that actually they don't really need a routine, or they're not too bothered about the routine schedule. Like, the schedule's up, but they never look at it. But still, their child is having huge meltdowns, maybe daily or several times a day, or they're tiptoeing around their child on a regular basis, or they find that they know themselves what's going to tip their child over the edge, and they're trying to avoid or micromanage the environment for the child, because that child really isn't doing anything to manage it themselves, and they're letting them, it's kind of like letting themselves be exposed to that thing that they can't manage, to the point where they then have a meltdown, and their nervous system can't cope anymore, and they get to the point where it's just not tolerable anymore. So, for example, the child who's really sensitive to noise, who actually doesn't complain about the noise in the classroom, or doesn't try to remove themselves from noisy situations like a busy canteen, or maybe a busy kind of marketplace, but then a half an hour later has a huge meltdown, is sprawled on the floor and is having a huge tantrum, and it's seemingly over nothing, but it's been this build up of not being able to cope with this for such a long time, and then this huge kind of letdown. And then in the same way we can be active or passive for an over-responsive sensory system, we can be active or passive in an under-responsive sensory system. So someone who's under-responsive, so that child who's getting minimal sensory feedback from their environment. For example, the child who doesn't cry when they fall, they just jump back up, or that child who seems really oblivious and everything seems to go over their head, or is like a couch potato and it takes a really long time to get them revved up and going. If they were being active about their profile, they'd actually seek out lots of sensory input, and they usually seek out that really alerting type sensory input. So that would be that kind of vestibular alerting type sensory input. So that twirling and very intense climbing maybe type input. Maybe they might seek out more proprioceptive input, just more nourishing information for their body, telling them about where their body is in space. And it's really essential that we do that, because as I mentioned before, everything we do in life is in relation to our own bodies. And then that child could also be passive, and I've come across quite a few of these kids, and literally you're trying to pull them up off the floor, that they really let their arousal system drop down into a really, really low state, and it's really difficult to get them going and keep them going. So for these kids, sometimes you might put in passive tools, and we'll talk about that loads in the second module, but things like move and sit cushions or movement breaks from the classroom or go noodle breaks in the classroom. All of these things really support that child to engage more and to be more alert. We might kind of be more specific about the types of foods we put in their lunchbox, things that are really alerting, like citrus foods and chewy foods, and really trying to get them going, having a drink on hand. So these kids need a lot of more adult support because they're not really doing what they need to do themselves. Particularly, I find for these children who are under responsive and active, sometimes they get into a lot of trouble because they find it really hard to sit still in the classroom and they're moving around a lot. And I always tell the teacher, and I would say the same for parents, that if the child is doing a lot of moving, but they're still able to keep the conversation going, they're able to respond appropriately to your questions, then we know that that input is organising and it's effective for them. It's having a really good impact on their nervous system. And that's something for you to remember too. If the child is doing loads of moving and seems really kind of chaotic in their movements, and when you try to have a chat with them, they're not responding to you and they're kind of off in their own world and they're not able to focus, then that movement's having a really disorganizing effect on their sensory system and it's overstimulating. And sometimes we might see kids who are over responsive kind of check out from their environment by doing lots of that movement. So it's kind of, a therapist will help you to pick out what's going on for your child. So then just going into the examples of the sensory regulation profiles, up there at the very top, that's Anne, and she's got a pretty typical sensory profile. She's going through these peaks and troughs of being in that low arousal state and then going up into the just right state, which is the dotted line in the middle. So in the morning, Anne starts off quite low, and then she has her breakfast, which is kind of it's tactile input to the mouth, it's taste and olfactory input, and that's really arousing. And she gets right up there into that just right state of work, and she can really function. But maybe she's been sitting at her desk for a long time, she hasn't really been moving, and her body drops down, and she's finding it really hard to focus by the time tea time comes at 10 or 10:30. So then she goes and she really gets her sensory system going again. So we're going through these peaks and troughs all day, doing little things that we all do to manage our sensory systems to get us back up into an alert, just right state. And then you can see there, Anne at the end of the day has quite a high peak. And she's getting up into that kind of more dysregulated place where we're not really functioning at our best, and maybe our nervous system isn't regulating our responses to the environment in the best possible way it could. I'm going to be really sexist here and describe a very old traditional description, but maybe Anne has come in from work at 5:30 and maybe the kids are in before her, maybe there was a babysitter or someone else in with them, maybe the kitchen's in chaos, so it's very visually overstimulating, maybe there's the smells of the dinner or the cooking, maybe there's the sound of the fan, maybe a radio's on, the chatter of the children, and all of this is just so overwhelming from Anne's sensory point of view. Maybe she's had quite a drive home and there's been lots of traffic and lots of frustration, emotional frustration as well, to layer on top of all of that. So if I was to go and ask Anne for a favour, this would be the worst possible time, because she might have quite an inappropriate response or kind of emotionally unchecked response to me, because she's just not able to manage her responses to the environment right now very well, because she's pushed up into that high range. So Anne is more likely to snap at me, or to be angry, or to try to get away from a situation, or to be avoidant. So and it's recognizing that people are in this state and that they're not actually able to have an appropriate response to you. And then if we come down to Paul is an over-responsive child or adult, and he's up here in this over-responsive state for pretty much most of the day. He's kind of like Anne at 5:30, and that is a really difficult place to be. And as an OT working with Paul, or a parent working with Paul, I'd really be trying to put in loads of those dampening sensory impacts on him. I'd be really trying to figure out what Paul is oversensitive to really try to reduce or eliminate those things from his day, so that maybe we could get him closer to that dotted line. Paul is having lots of meltdowns. Maybe he's not managing his sense. Paul, because he's so high up there, he's probably quite passive about his sensory profile, because he's not doing anything to get himself down to that just right line. And then, as you can see, the opposite then is Carl, who's in a really low state of arousal for most of the day and needs so much sensory input to get him up there to that just right line. For Paul, we'd be doing the opposite then, finding out what's alerting for him and really trying to put more of that into his day.
And Claire, just on the just right, that's where our neurological system and our body, that's where it's the most functional and the most comfortable, isn't it?
And that's where we can assess the situation and respond in the most appropriate way. Our reflexes will be better, our emotional or social engagement and responses will be more graded and appropriate. And that's when we're at our happiest, that's when we're functioning at our peak performance, isn't it? So this is a really good image, and lots of people find this really useful. So Paul, who we discussed here in the centre, who was a very high arousal state, if you imagine a little cup in Paul's chest that collects the sensory information that we get exposed to during the day, Paul's cup's very small and it doesn't take very much to fill it right up to the brim, and then it's overflowing. And things that we see for over-responsive children might be that they might, when the cup is overflowing, they can be aggressive, distractible, they can be anxious, avoidant, intolerant of change, or they might seem, when the cup is overflowing, they might seem very chaotic, they might seem like they're just very disorganized, play, running from thing to thing, but actually not playing with anything in a very meaningful way. Maybe very fussy and intolerant, lots of meltdowns. So all those things that we've described before. And then this slide is just an information slide for you to go through in more detail at home, but an active approach, a child with an active approach, a Paul with a small cup who's active about it might engage in calming activities, they might remove themselves from situations, they might appear to be stubborn or moody or inflexible, they might be very picky or selective. And then the child who's a passive approach, who's not doing anything about trying to stop the overflow, they're going to need lots of added monitoring. They might come across as really hyper and uncontrollable. They might seem more flexible, but actually having loads of meltdowns. And I've kind of described that all already. So now Trish is going to take us through under responsive. Yeah, brilliant. The under responsive profile.
So just following on from what Claire was saying, so our under responsive gang of children who have these bigger cups, and the rim of our cup is where, when our cups are full, so whether it's a small cup or a large cup, when our cups are full, that's when we're at our just right. That's when we're at our just right state. And so if you have a very large cup, you have a lot more to do from a sensory point of view to fill it up right to that rim, to that just right stage. So our under responsive kids with their really big cups, they may not notice things like their messy faces, their hands. They may not notice that their uniforms are on backwards or their top is hanging out. They often appear to be daydreaming or a little bit unfocused. As we said earlier, they're often the children who might give themselves a terrible bang off something, but not notice it, or they have quite high pain tolerance. They may have low muscle tone, so they're the kids that are slumping and slouching, and they may crash into walls or floors. They may touch everything. So when they're touching or crashing into things, they're using their tactile sense and their proprioceptive sense as well to try and fill up that cup with some more sensory information so that their body can get into that just right state where they can feel comfortable interacting and learning. These children with the bigger cup, the under-responsive children, may have a delayed response to things. So Claire went through that nicely in that first slide. So they may be children that take in, they may have a delayed reaction. So they may be the children that have the meltdowns many hours after an event happens. They can be children who are really compliant, easygoing, not disruptive. These aren't children that are drawing a lot of attention to themselves in the classroom. They may find tasks effortful and tiring because their muscle tone and their postural control issues. They may be somebody who uses fidgeting to try and fill up their cup, so frequently fidgeting, frequently moving. and they can have an inconsistent performance over the day. So depending on their arousal levels or their alertness levels throughout the day. If you are a child or an adult with one of those larger cups and you have more of an active approach to getting your body into the just right state, you tend to try to doing something to try and rev your engine up. So you will be the person who's fidgeting. You will be the person who's pacing while listening. You may be the person who's going from, they may be the child who's going from rugby training to GA training to athletics in the evening and come home and goes out and kicks a football until 10 o'clock at night. So they may seem like they have a high activity level as they are striving to try and fill up their cup with sensory information so their body can get to the just right state. So that can be one approach to your under-responsive neurosystem. And then there's the other one that Claire mentioned, the more passive approach. This is the person who doesn't do anything to change that internal engine, doesn't do anything to get their engine going. So that is the daydreamer, the tuning out. They seem quite lethargic. They tend not to ask for help. The adult who is with them is often feeling quite frustrated with them and feeling quite exhausted because they feel like they're pouring a lot of energy into the child to get them going, to get them revved up. Physically, these are often the children that you see that are slumped, that the heads are down, the shoulders are rounded, and you have that little C on the back. And they may also fall more and trip and bump into things because they're not noticing or they're not as orientated to their environment when their cup isn't full and they're not in that just right stage. So there are strategies and resources specifically around how to manage this under-responsive system and how to support an under-responsive child that we go through in Module 2. Claire, was there anything you wanted to
No,
add
I think that's pretty well covered. No, I think that's pretty good. So I think we're coming to the end now, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah. So everyone, thank you so much for listening to us for the last while, and well done on getting through the first module. The link to your second module should have come in the same email. Have a look through the resources that came to you, and do share what you have learned from today's module with the other important adults in your child's life. And when you're ready, you can start Module 2 and enjoy.
If you have any questions from today's session, make sure to jot them down. Hopefully they'll be answered in Module 2, but if not, we'll try to answer them in the live session. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.